All right, you primitive screwheads, listen up.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Here's Johnny.
Vanity. Definitely my favorite sin.
I am the devil, and I am here to do the devil's work.
The power of Christ compels you!
This is my boomstick.
What's your favorite scary movie?
Good evening, and welcome to Shiver, a horror movie podcast. We are your hosts.
I'm Daniel DeBona.
And I'm David Ulloa. And we are here this week to finish out our Folk Monster Month, our month of the Folk Monster, before we move into well, I mean, it's always spooky season here at Shiver.
Right.
But before we move into a spooky month with the month of October, so we are when Daniel and I spoke about this, and I don't want to give myself any credit here because this was all Daniel's idea. He was like, dude, we have to end. There's one we have to end with for Folk Monster Month. It has to be Pan's Labyrinth. And I was really excited because I think I've seen Pan's Labyrinth only twice. And not because I don't absolutely love this movie, because I'm not going to bury the lead here. I think that this is one of the greatest movies of all time.
Right.
Like not greatest horror movies, fantasy, or anything like that. Just greatest movies of all time. This is a really difficult watch.
Yes.
It is so dark. It is it's so devastating, this movie. But I feel like it has to be.
Yeah.
It has to be. This is one of those movies that needs to crush you. So Daniel, what's your relationship with this movie?
So I saw this movie for the first time, and I had absolutely no idea. I knew nothing about it. It was something that I just kind of stumbled across, and I saw it, and I was blown away at how good this movie is. And about a year later, I was at my parents' house, and my mom had like picked it up on Blu-ray on sale somewhere, and so I was just like, I was like, oh man, I love this movie, and like moms do. She was like, oh, take it then. Like, I don't know that I'm gonna watch it again. So I've had this on physical format and on Blu-ray for a very long time, and this is a movie that I find myself watching not a ton, but definitely more than the twice that you've seen it. This movie, it's got a weird way of dragging up a lot of things. Not a weird way. I mean, it's pretty straightforward why it does it, but it drags up it drags up a lot of stuff in you. I mean, there's so much encompassed in this movie, whether it be the historical or wartime themes, the fantasy type things. And yes, we are playing very fast and loose with the word horror in this movie, but I am sure that by the end of it, we will convince you why we feel like this movie is worthy of our horror podcast. But the war themes, the childhood trauma themes, just the idea of what we've been doing all month, which is fairy tales and folklore going back to these really dark origins that they had when they weren't just to lull children to sleep. The origin of the folk tale and the fairy tale were usually precautionary. You were told that these monsters existed because that way you stayed where you were supposed to be. If there were things in the woods that would eat you, you wouldn't leave the village. If there was a horse that would suck you up and drag you into the water and drown you when you got too close, then you wouldn't fuck around at the water without your parents. These things were so much more than just, hey, here's something fun to do before you go to bed. They served a societal function. And this movie takes that idea and runs so far with it. And it not only shows these fairy tales as serving some sort of function, but it also shows them as this, kind of mirror held up to what's happening at the time. Understanding that at, in your darkest, there's always something else. And that there's all these ideas that get wrapped up into this movie. And then you just top it all off with the, just A1 god tier, like puppetry and animatronics and special effects that are a Guillermo del Toro movie. And we're 5.5 minutes in. You guys know where this episode's going. I mean, this movie just it does it all, and it does it all so well. And you're right, and it's crushing. It is crushing at so many points, just to have an ending that then pulls it all together so beautifully that the reason that the tears are coming down your face has changed. And so I mean, this movie's a lot of things, and I'm excited to get into them.
For me, I didn't see this one in theaters. I don't know how wide a release it got here in the States.
Right.
But I feel like it was being talked about a lot very soon after its release. And it was a movie that I rented on DVD. And my wife and I we were dating at the time. And I remember we went and we went to Blockbuster, which was like right down the street from her parents' house. And we picked up the movie. We were very excited. We came back, and I was expecting something along the lines of maybe like a Time Bandits or something like that. Something a little bit more lighthearted, something that was gonna obviously lean into the dark fantasy, but maybe something like Dark Crystal. And it was a grueling 2-hour experience, because it's so dark, like I said, but you're rooting for these characters.
Yeah.
And it always reminds me of did you ever see Sunset Boulevard?
I've not seen Sunset Boulevard.
It's always on those lists of like the greatest movies of all time, and I do think it deserves to be up there. It might be the greatest film noir. It starts with the main character dead. And from the very beginning, the character's narrating it. He's telling you he's dead. And you're watching the movie and you're so engrossed in what's going on, you forget that this started with his death. And
Carlito's Way does that too.
Carlito's Way. Yeah. I mean, this is such a great storytelling device, because immediately you're sucked in. You're like, how did we get here? And there's very few movies that I think pull this off so well, where at the end of the movie, you're rooting. She's got to live. She's got to live. She's got to live. And you have forgotten that she's been dead the whole time. Yep. And that she must die. And the thing is that for this story to work, everyone needs to be dead.
Yeah.
No one can survive, because no one really does survive this. You speak to people who live through what is depicted in Pan's Labyrinth, and they're never the same people they were before events like that.
Right.
And if you grow up with that as part of your family history, like I have, like I have heard my grandparents and my parents talk about what it was like in Cuba before, during, and after the revolution. And it's exactly this, man. And so I think that you don't need to have this in your history to appreciate it. You certainly don't. And I think that particularly for people who don't really understand what that's like, this is maybe even more important.
Right.
Because you see what it does to people. And it's like, it's very easy to want to say like, yeah, we're going to storm a Capitol and we're going to take this back, even though there's been an election, because we want it that badly.
Yeah.
But when you see what that sort of action does to people, if you watch this movie and don't have a transformative experience, and I know that sounds grandiose, but if you watch Pan's Labyrinth and don't have a transformative experience, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing is, when you watch this movie, and it's real easy to forget that this was 80 years ago, that
Mhm.
is when this movie is placed. And from researching and reading, it's remarkably historically accurate with kind of the way things happen in this movie. And things evolve and change so fast that the 90s sometimes seem like they weren't that long ago. They were 30 years ago.
Mhm.
But then you start thinking, and it's like, wait, this was in the 40s, not the 1840s.
Yeah.
This wasn't it was the mid 1900s. This was not that long ago. There were people who would have been the age of characters in this movie that are still alive.
Yeah.
That quite accurately lived through this.
Mhm.
And because that was one thing that kept getting us as we were watching it. It was like, was like medicine and science and some of this really that bad in 45? It doesn't seem like it should be that distant. We
Mhm.
get so used to the way that everything is moving so fast that I mean, this was not that long ago. And you're watching these people who seem like peasants, just standing outside a barn hoping to get their bread and cheese.
Mhm.
And you're thinking, oh, this had to have been so long ago. When was the last time people lived like this? Yeah, the 40s, the mid 40s
Yeah.
is when this movie takes place. And
It's 1944, right?
yeah, 44 or 45.
Yeah. And to put that into perspective, antibiotics are not discovered till 1928. That's when penicillin is first used.
Right.
So we're talking about like not even 20 years from the invention of antibiotics.
Yeah. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
you're right. It's wild when this movie starts to hit you in those ways that you realize how not distant history this was, and like just as a sidebar, it's one of those things where when I was teaching like second and third grade and Black History Month would roll around and you start to teach some of these lessons and teach about some of these historical figures, I'd have to be like, and by the way, this isn't ancient history. Like, this is something
Mhm.
you could literally talk to your grandparents about because they live, or great grandparents. I was teaching younger kids, but you could talk to people in your family who lived through this. Like, I'm not talking about something that's that old, but it seems so long ago because things are so different. And yeah, 80 years is a lot of time in a human lifespan, but in the
Right.
grand scheme of time, 80 years is a blip, right? So I think that this movie does an amazing job of just constantly painting a picture of despair and the lengths that the human mind, especially the child mind, will go through to deal with it. There's a an amazing argument here for for how much of this is just kind of spirited away style fantasy,
Right.
and how much of it is actually she's living a fairy tale, right? But if you, it's an argument not worth making because this movie never claims to be anything but a fairy tale.
Right. And that's kind of where I think we're headed here with the story, right? So in a section we're calling War, what is it good for? This story, this kind of is not the story of the Spanish Civil War that brought Francisco Franco's fascist regime into power. This is the story of how it already had come to power and squashed all rebellion.
Right.
But it's not even really the story of that. This is the beautiful thing about Guillermo del Toro, I think, is that he understands, as many filmmakers do, that the worst, most like insane things that you want to document, when you tell it from the point of view of one person,
Right.
that's when these things become the most moving, the most powerful. And so we have a war story that isn't really a war story. It's a coping story.
Yeah.
We have one little girl and her mother who are coping, and they're coping in different ways. So what does this story do for you as a war story, as a fantasy, and as a human story?
So, we've spent a lot of time in the past couple of years talking about movies that deal with the idea of trauma and grief. And what we don't often see in those movies is what leads to those moments. There's usually a little bit of exposition, and then we're just in the grief, and we have to learn to feel it through the emotions of the character. What's great about this movie is we're immediately thrown into this Francoist Spain, and you're just trying to figure that part out. And then you're given little tidbits of okay, yeah, just call him father. It's just a word, don't call him the general or whatever.
Mhm.
And so you're seeing that what you're dealing with here is not just the trauma of living with a deceased father, but it's also there's a grieving to be had in this for a life that these people once knew. And I think that what this story does amazingly is it really kind of thrusts us into this position of finding solace in fantasy. Finding for it to be an escapism thing, an escapism thing that becomes very real. And so while neither one of us are, from Spain, let alone alive in the 40s, we feel the grieving process for a non-Francoist Spain, right? For a time when people were not living under a dictator. We can feel a grieving for that in the actions and the emotions of the people that were given. And then we can feel a bizarre sense of joy in this little girl who has found that her one way kind of in the world to help is to be there for her mother.
Mhm.
And instead of retreating into herself and this becoming just a weird grief trope, what this becomes is okay, well, what are you going to do about it? And we see this little girl, we see Ophelia conquer this idea for an extent of what can she do. All she has in this world is her mother and her unborn brother. And if she can't do anything else, what she can do is take care of them. And then she is immediately thrust into this fantasy, not sci-fi, fantasy horror type world that is oddly contrasted against the real life horrific events of living in a dictatorship.
Mhm.
So you're looking at the pale man, and you're looking at crawling through the mud to find a giant toad. You're looking at this beastly creature in the fawn, and all of these things are better than the world she would have if she weren't a fairy tale girl. And that story, that idea of the movie contrasting those two things, taking this concept of these awful chores given to you by a monster being the better option than just living and just carrying on in this world. That's wild to me. That's so crazy that when you're watching it, you're like, yeah, that sucks, and that's really scary what she's going through. But also, that guy just beat a dude to death with a hammer because he lost some bread and tobacco, right? It's you get this weird juxtaposition of what's horrific, and it kind of it blows me away every time.
I For me, the thing that really gets me about this is whenever we see stories that depict people, kids primarily, retreating into fantasies because their lives are just horrendous. These fantasies tend to be beautiful.
Right.
Wizard of Oz comes to mind. Grave of the Fireflies comes to
Oh
mind.
my God.
My Neighbor Totoro,
Yes.
very few do it as well as the Japanese do.
Oh man, spirit. Like it's like I said earlier,
Spirited Away. Yeah. And a lot of that is really just like the magic mind of Hayao Miyazaki.
Yeah.
But what I love about this movie is that the point is made that life is so bleak, reality is so disgusting, that this world, this fantasy world that Ophelia has crafted, where this creature that you see behind us is chasing after her, this is preferable to reality. To me, that's wild, man.
Yeah.
Like I remember the first time that I realized as a teacher that my concept of what reality is not everyone else's concept of reality. I had a student who turned in a homework assignment written on the like the cardboard that's on the back of a notebook. Like you ripped it out off the ring, and I was like, dude, what is this, man? And he was like, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't find any paper. And I was like, you're gonna have to redo this, man, come on. And he goes, okay. So he goes back, and at the end of class, after everyone left, he came up to me and he said, listen, man, I ran out of paper, and mom says she's not getting paid for, I don't know how long, and I had nowhere else to do my homework. And I realized at that moment, I was like, my reality is not this kid's reality.
Right.
Like that was one of those like shocking moments for me, where it's like you're hoping that you can do your homework on this cardboard. That's what the monster reality is for Ophelia, where it's like, I hope that I can be chased by this monster because I can identify this monster.
Right.
Because I can run from this monster. I can't run from the monster in my home.
Right.
I love the fact that she never called him dad.
Yes.
Because there's such a fear there. And I think that there's something that's often overlooked is how scary it is to be a child. It's very easy to grow up and get caught up in the world of like, I've got bills to pay. I've got a job to do. I've got mouths to feed. Like, I've got my own thing going on here. Like, all you're doing, like, you're going to school and like, maybe you've got a job, but like, you're a kid. How bad can it be? And it can be really bad.
Yeah.
And we forget how just like sometimes the way that we look at them, if they've disappointed us and we look disappointed, that can be fucking terrifying for a kid, man.
Yeah, man.
And I think that there's such an amazing job done here by all involved. But this, I mean, it really does boil down to the fact that Del Toro understands what it's like to be so scared that you would rather run away from the scariest monster you can think of than being in a house, well fed, well clothed, with a monster you can't do anything about.
Yeah, there's like that last bit you said, right? Where she's well fed. She's got good clothes. She's got the big house with fires in every room. Painted against the backdrop of these people who are literally standing in line to get their loaf of bread and their cheese. So there's the initial gut reaction of like, well, like you said, what does this girl have to worry about? And she's got as good as life seems to get for these people. But then you have to take into consideration, one, yes, not her actual father. We don't know. We know he died in the war. That's all we know, right? So you can make assumptions all day as to which side of the war he was on, but she does seem to be pretty staunchly against the Francoists.
Mhm.
And so you start to realize there's the horror of, not only did you lose your father, but now the people who killed your father are now claiming to be your new family. He,
Right.
he makes no qualms about the fact that he doesn't give a shit about Ophelia, right? Like
No.
he doesn't care at all. The very first thing he
Or
says,
her mother even, really.
yeah, she's a baby factory. Her
Yeah.
mom is just a baby factory. He needs to carry on his name. But there's a really profound sense of understanding to be found in this little girl who is immediately drawn to Mercedes and understands kind of what is going on in the world outside her own home, which is amazing. Right, to create this character who and tell this story of a girl who she's literally rebelling against her entire culture at this point. I mean, the Francoists had won. It was now a dictatorship. This is like you said earlier, this is a post-war movie. She's not living through the Spanish Civil War. She's living through the aftermath of it.
Mhm.
And it's so often that when here in America when we get real tunnel vision about it, and we're like, oh, Civil War, the good guys won, because that's what happens in civil wars. You get a movie like this that reminds you, like, hey, it's history is written by the victors, but then you still somehow end up on the wrong side of it. And just because they won, just because their coup was successful, doesn't make them the good guys. It's not always downtrodden good guys fighting against powerful overlords that are evil. Sometimes it's downtrodden bad guys who have enough numbers and strategy to win.
Yeah.
And she understood all of this. And so this is the horror of her reality. This is just how absolutely terrifying it is to live through this. And you're right. She's like I said, she's crawling through mud trying to convince a giant toad to give her a key. That's out of context. That's so bizarre and not
Right.
scary at all. Right? But then you're watching it and you're like, okay, yes, one, because of the way what this movie is, it's scary. But two, like we keep going back to, this girl chose to do this rather than just hang out in a bedroom with her mom and a doctor and wait for her brother to be born. She was like, no, that's what I've got to do. I've got to crawl through the mud. I've got to find that key. I've got to prove I'm the princess, because there's got to be a better world than this. And that's storytelling. Like that is motherfucking storytelling. There's a very good there's a host of reasons why this is considered to be Del Toro's masterpiece. Like, this is the one that they mention in all of his obituaries someday, right?
Mhm.
And that reason is because he is constantly folding in more layers to this story that always make it better. We have talked on this podcast before about stories being complicated to the deficit of the movie. This is one where the complexity of the story is very much to the benefit of the movie. This is a movie where you're desperately always waiting for a new bit because you want more story, because he's doing such an amazing job taking us through all of this. I just, like I said, this is probably my 9th or 10th time seeing this movie, and
Wow.
I'm absolutely amazed every time.
I mean, I'm sure I would be as well, had it been that many times I've seen this movie. Because this is I think I've seen it twice before this. And, I every time I watch this, I end in tears.
Yeah.
And it's not just at the end either. It's throughout. The and I remember this happening specifically, the first time I saw this movie as well. The first time that, the, is it, the colonel? The general
The general, yeah.
that he kills someone, and he kills
Or
the
Captain Vidal.
captain. It is captain. Yeah. When he kills the rabbit hunter's son.
Oh my
I
god.
cry every time, man. I cry every time because there's so many stories that my grandparents have told me of exactly that, of seeing that happen right in front of them, and how, you know, the country that they loved turned into something else entirely. Like, you don't even recognize it anymore. And every time that I turn on the news here and I see something where I'm like, man, I don't even recognize this place anymore. That's not 100% true.
Right.
There's still something of the DNA here, but that's not what it was in Franco Spain. That's not what it is in Cuba. It's not what it is in Venezuela. It's not what it is in Nicaragua. Like, there's so many places, like, pretty close to home. You don't have to go that far. You don't have to go to Europe. You don't have to go to Asia to find that. And I think that ultimately there are so many people who have been affected by stories like this, that it really is the story of humanity, because all of our families have at some point been damaged by war, and we've all hoped to be reunited with our families, and that's really what this is Ophelia wanting to be whole again, because what it is that Pan offers her is to be reunited with her family, with her true mother and her true father. And what I love is that in the end, her mother was her true mother.
Right.
And I also love that there's such a we'll get to that when we talk about the technical stuff. But there's a lot of art in here that
Yeah.
that is just like, man, Del Toro knows exactly what to do to
Well,
get us to feel the way he wants us to feel.
man, and when you're talking about this story making you feel, when so after she goes into Pale Man's lair and she
Mhm.
retrieves the dagger and you can't help herself, she eats the grape, she's got to run from him, she manages to escape. There's a third mission, that has to be accomplished. She doesn't know what it is yet. She's waiting for the book to tell it, but she gets real busy with taking care of her sick mom and all of this. And the fawn shows up in her bedroom and just fucking reams her. I mean, just leans all on her about how she didn't follow instructions. She broke the rules. It's all ruined. She's not the real princess. And man, in a movie that is based entirely on loss, I mean, this movie starts with the loss of a free Spain, right?
Mhm.
And then we find out this girl's lost her father. She loses her mother. Del Toro is relentless in this idea of making this movie about loss. And in that moment, dude, I am heartbroken every fucking time because he just tells her off. You're not the real princess. All of
Mhm.
this is ruined. This was for nothing. You've wasted my time. And then just dips and he's done. And that was all she had left. Right? That was all the hope she had, was that maybe there was that real family out there. And God, that scene is heartbreaking. And you're sitting there and you're rooting for Ophelia, and you know that she's just doing right by this family, the one she has now, the concrete family. We talked before about that idea of like the Aristotle chair versus the actual one, right? She's fighting for the family that she can grab and touch right now, while
Mhm.
also hoping that the idea that exists of her real family is out there. And now this has all been ripped from her. Every bit of this just dragged out of her. And that scene, every time, it just rips my heart out of my chest. And it's the first time when we kind of see Pan the fawn as monstrous, right? Not just a dude. It's the first time when we see him with this extreme amount of emotion, and he leans in on this little girl as if he has no idea what's going on. And the human part of you is like, oh God, I can't. Why would he do this to her?
Mhm.
And it's just like we keep saying, it is just such amazing storytelling, because you need that moment. You need that moment to then ask yourself, would I then draw just a little bit of blood from my newborn brother if it was going to end all this? If I could fix what I screwed up by eating those grapes, does it become worth that?
Mhm.
And you start to have that moment where you're like, is this little girl better than me? Because it doesn't seem like, like cutting a kid's hand is that bad if it ends all of this. And then we're immediately kind of inundated with the amazing just fortitude of the childhood spirit, and somebody who, again, when she gets to that moment, now she doesn't even know if the fantasy family is an option. So she is down to just this baby. That's all she's got left. And she makes the decision to not, and then chooses to throw it all away to save him. And you're just, again, I'm always just dumbfounded by
Mhm.
how amazing that all plays out. And just kind of seg here into our next bit, because the reason that all of that works so well is because of some of the performances that are given to us here. So in a section we're calling Freedom Fighters, Fascist Blighters, and Fantasy Abiders, let's talk about the characters. We've dropped some names here and there. I mean, who sticks out for you? Who are you going to talk about first?
Listen, this is a stacked cast. Like, there's not one role that is like mediocre.
Right.
Forget like bad. Like, everyone just fucking nails it. But if there is one person that I have to talk about first, it's Ivana Baquero as Ophelia. Like,
Oh, yeah.
she is like insanely good. I talked about how you're rooting for her to escape. You're rooting for her to have this life. I'm rooting for her to actually be this, like, this moon princess.
Right.
And the sad thing is I almost convinced myself that this time it would work,
Right.
because she's so good and she wants to do good, like not just for her, but for her mother, for her brother. And we start seeing really early on that even though it's not the point of the movie that she sympathize with the rebels, the freedom fighters out in the hills, but she does. And I think that we were older when 9/11 happened.
Right.
You and I, we were you were in college, right?
Yeah, I was 18.
Yeah, so I was in high school, old enough where like I understood everything that was going on. Like I have cousins that are younger than me, and they were really young and they understood. Like there's things that happen where it's like, you know what, this is really complex, and I'm just a kid, but I understand what the fuck is going on right now, and I have an opinion. And the crazy thing is that your opinions don't always line up with what your parents' opinions are.
Right.
When it's something so innate, when it's something so primal, like you know what you know, and you know what you believe because it speaks to you. It speaks to your heart, it speaks to your soul. And she knows that Captain Vidal is a monster. Like that, he is the true monster in this movie.
Correct.
It's not Pan, it's not the Pale Man. For starters, they don't exist,
Right.
and he does. So, for me, it's all about her, man. Like she really does give, and I've never seen her in anything else. And I'm looking at um, her list of movies here, and like she hasn't stopped working.
Yeah,
Like
no,
there's a ton of stuff here.
I remember the Shannara Chronicles existing as a TV show, but I never watched it.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I can't say that I mean, it's probably a lot of Spanish movies and Spanish TV, um, as is natural for a Spanish actress. Go figure, right? But I would have to say that this is the performance of a lifetime. And it's
She
kinda sad to say that about, someone who worked on something, like, literally almost 20 years ago, but it's like, how do you top this?
Yeah, like, it was she's incredible in it because for all of the storytelling elements that we have described, for everything that we've talked about laying this idea of fantasy horror on top of historical real life horror, she's the one who has to live them both.
Mhm,
She's the one who she is the medium through which we can compare these two things. Without the character of Ophelia, we would not be able to understand the idea of putting these two horrors side by side and making the decision about which one is worse. Because you're right. I mean, you would have to be one of the absolute worst kind of people if when this movie was over, somehow Vidal was not ultimately the villain. Right.
yeah,
Like I can't even wrap my head around the type of person that it would take. And the performance that we get out of Ivana for as Ophelia for to compare these two things is unreal. I mean, she was 11, man. She was
mhm,
11 out here just absolutely dominating. And I mean, this is her movie. So yeah, there's really nowhere else to go first.
mhm,
I am going to stick in the vein of badass women that are in this movie
mhm,
and talk about Maribel Verdú as Mercedes.
mhm.
She
Excellent pronunciation, by the way.
thank you. Um she's so fucking cool. Like there's almost no other word, right? Like there were plenty of other words that you can use to
Yeah,
describe her. She's tough, but she's cool, man. She's out here, living right underneath the captain. And she's, just just Tokyo Rosing it, just running all this info back and forth. She's sneaking stuff into the woods to the freedom fighters. She's protecting Ophelia, and she's doing all of this as the kind of, just understated woman character. That first time when we actually follow her out into the woods and we get to meet the freedom fighters, she's still being very much portrayed as out of her depth. And she's doing this because it's what's right and because her brother's out there, but she's still very much not quite sure. And at the end of that scene, we watch her start to put it together, where she's disgusted at herself for living right next to the captain and serving his food and stuff like that. And man, when that switch flips, holy damn.
Yeah.
When she gets that knife in his mouth and then just Glasgow smiles out the side of his cheek, and then just kind of, pulls her little shawl up over her head, and then just nonchalantly walks all out of the compound and goes. You're thinking she can't get any more badass. And then when she shits on the captain's monologue at the end, he will
never know you even existed.
Oh man, I've got chills right now remembering it. That is so powerfully and matter-of-factly delivered from somebody who early on, was just kind of just was so worried about everything that she's spacing out, chopping potatoes and stuff. And she just so expertly makes this man realize how fucking tiny he is. And his entire existence seemed to be based on proving to everyone how not tiny he was, what a big, strong man he was. And his line was going to carry on and watch me kill this guy and then show no remorse when I shouldn't have, because he actually was a rabbit hunter. I mean, this dude's entire persona was trying to big dick. That's it. He just wanted to be Captain Big Dick. That was his whole fucking shit. And she perfectly ends him in every single way. And I love Mercedes so much as a character. She is just perfect in everything she does.
The scene I always go back to with her is and I think describes the people like Mercedes so perfectly. We know she's got the knife,
right?
She just given the Glasgow smile. They finally catch her, right? And she's holding the knife up, and she's utterly surrounded.
Yeah.
And she's literally brought a knife to a gunfight. And there is no backing down.
Nope.
None at all. And yet she knows that she's not going to win this one. And that's when she puts the knife up to her own throat.
Yes.
Like, I would rather end myself than let you do anything to me. You have no power over me. That's what that message is. You have no power over me. I have so much power over myself, and you have no power over me, that I will end myself to prove it to you. What a fucking badass, man. Like, we so often hear stories of the war hero, and the war hero always looks like Captain Vidal.
Mm-hmm.
They very rarely in the stories look like Mercedes.
Right.
And so, thing is, you hear about the war stories. You read about war stories. And little by little, you start to see that women were just as important to the war effort as men. And it goes beyond the Rosie the Riveter thing. It's beyond a campaign thing. Like, there literally is no winning a war without women. And it's not the glorified Captain America look, but it's there. and
Yeah.
there's such a strength in that, because it's always some crazy spy shit, and a man will fall
Yeah.
apart. We see it because the doctor can't do it. Eventually,
Yeah.
he gives himself up, and it's for a good reason, right? He's putting this guy out of his misery,
Right.
and he lets him know, and he knows what's going to happen, right? But she never ever crumbles under the weight of what it is that she has to do.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
there's so many reasons for her to, and she doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, she ends up living that. Who is it? Is it a Zapata quote where it's better to live on your it's better to die on your feet than live on
Than
your
live on
knees.
your knees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like, you know, she becomes that moment. So yeah, just unbelievable, unreal.
Absolutely. So I'm a little conflicted about what I'm going to talk about next, because I said earlier he's the real monster, but he's um but he's not the monster, you know. So Sergi Lopez, who plays Captain Vidal, man, what a monstrous dude.
Oh my God.
And I feel like so rarely is there a performance where like just the sight of the person will make you hate them. You know, like there's
Yeah.
definitely characters that I think are like monsters in human skin. Many years ago we did on the Mount Geekmore podcast, like the Mountain of Villains, movie villains.
Oh yeah.
And my number one was Noah Cross from Chinatown. And like he's fucking despicable. You know, the sight of him just makes you like, oh, I can't believe people like that exist. And that's what this is, you know? And like there's people in our own lives where when we see them, we're like, how are you walking free? Like how has no one put you down for the shit you do? So when we see someone get justice, like what's going on now with Puff Daddy, you know, when you finally see justice happening, like that's a beautiful thing. But when it's still, when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the eye of the storm, and it's like there's no end to this fucking thing, man. It's so bleak, and he does such a good job of letting you feel powerless in this. It's a brilliant performance. It's truthfully, a lot of the reason why I can't rewatch this movie so often is because of how good his performance is as just a despicable human being.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he's from the moment we meet him, right? And it's like you're meeting your new daughter, and the all he says to her is he grabs her
With the
hand
other hand.
and then tells her she's supposed to shake with the other hand and then just moves on. You're immediately like, oh, okay, so this guy's a piece of shit, right? Like we're good now. Like, yes, I knew he was like a civil guard captain, but now I'm 100% sure that this guy's a piece of shit. Um, and then it's just nonstop. You know, when you hear him, you hear him, you know, say, well, if you have to make, you know, just without thinking, if you have to make the choice, you know, save the baby, let the mother die, you know, that whole thing.
Mhm.
And it's such cold and calculated decision in the way he says it. You know, there's no moment to think about it. The doctor doesn't even fucking bring it up.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a situation where the doctor comes to him and he's like, I don't know how this is gonna go. He says it when she's not getting better, right? Like he says it when she's on the upswing before all hell breaks loose. And so you look at stuff like that, and you look at the rabbit hunter's son, because immediately he then finds the rabbit in the bag. There's no remorse there. He just looks at him and it tells him to search him better so he doesn't have to get his hands dirty again over some
Right.
bullshit. And the way, God, that fucking classic villain move of trapping the spy or the person when he gives her the whole like but I have the only key, right? And they didn't break the lock. They blew up so much, but they didn't break the lock. Okay, yeah, no, you have a good night. Thank you. You're just so disgusted because he knows, she knows, he knows. And it's like, oh God, it's like it's Hans Landa levels, right?
Yes, absolutely, dude. And that wouldn't be for another couple of years, but I think that's the only performance that comes close.
Yes. And yeah, he is. He's absolutely despicable. He is the biggest part of what makes the movie tough to watch. He really is. And then, like I said earlier, you're just watching him as a tiny man, where he's just a guy. Like I said, you look it up. I mean, he's a captain in the Civil Guard. And he's got this one house and this one area of woods where he's supposed to be taking out one area of rebels. That's it. But he considers himself a god of where they are. And so he's such an insignificant speck in the history of what we're watching unfold here. And all we do is watch him scream into the void about how powerful he is and what a great man he is. And so you just end up hating him so damn much. But yeah, shout out to him. It was Sergey something, right?
It was
Sergey
Lopez.
Lopez.
Yeah.
He killed it, man. He was incredible in that role. So, sorry, I got choked up there. So, as far as human characters go, I mean, those are really the only three that play any significant portion of the movie. So, we are going to move forward as we finish up the month of the folk monster in a section that we have been calling Legend Has It. We're going to discuss the monsters in this movie. So, what we have here are kind of two main ones, and then you can kind of go from there, right? We've discussed how Vidal is ultimately the monster here, but we need to get into the folk tale monster that we've got here. So we've got the faun, we've got Pan essentially, and we've got Pale Man, who was created, and the frog, yes, and they were created for this movie, but ultimately this movie being a fairy tale puts them there. So tell us about him, man.
Darth Vader has less than 8 minutes of screen time in Empire Strikes Back. And yet,
is that a real statistic?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me look it up. Darth Vader screen time. Yeah, it's insane. I think it might be 6 minutes. So Darth Vader has approximately 34 minutes of screen time in the entire trilogy.
Holy shit.
Right. The Pale Man is in this movie for one scene.
Yeah.
That one scene is less than 5 minutes. Less than 5 minutes of screen time. And I don't think that I have ever been the same.
Yeah.
I was considering putting this on for Link. Because I was like, it's dark fantasy. I hadn't seen it in a couple of years, right? And like, it's dark fantasy. I know he tends to like this stuff. And I was like, you know what? Might not be the right time to put this on for him. I was like, okay, I'm going to show you a picture. And if you can handle this, you can watch this movie. If you can't, you definitely can't watch this movie. And I showed him the picture that's in the background. And he just looked at me and he said, why would you do that to me? He goes, I'm not watching this movie, man.
Fair.
dude, this I don't understand what happened to Guillermo del Toro. That that he comes up with this. But what I can tell you is that this is possibly the scariest monster I think I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I can't think of another one that would be on this level. I think the only thing that comes close, and it doesn't actually meet it, might be the Crooked Man from what was this?
Insidious
The second
2.
not Insidious, no. The other one.
Oh, yep. The one with the Warrens. And
Yeah, the one with the Warrens.
and there's the nun, and they go to
Yeah,
yeah,
that one
yeah,
that we're
that one.
both blanking on right now, right? Don't do drugs, kids. Man, fucking wow, right? But then the Fawn, dude. This thing manages to be
Conjuring 2.
Thank you, Conjuring. God, dude, getting old sucks.
Yeah, dude.
Dude, the Fawn manages to be hideous, terrifying, and inviting all at once. That scene when she runs right up to him and hugs him, like, I understand where she's coming from. Like, her life has fallen to bits since the last time she saw the Fawn. He was angry. He was scary, dude.
Yeah.
And what she's doing is she's running into his arms. Dude, these are the kinds of monsters that we can only dream up in our worst nightmares, but more so. I don't know how Del Toro does it, man. And the thing is, he doesn't miss, because I would say arguably this is his magnum opus.
Yeah.
But that's not taking anything away from the other movies that he, like, literally every Del Toro movie has something on this level.
Yeah.
Insane.
Yeah. So, yeah, the Pale Man, like you said, he's got his one scene. He is just nightmare fuel incarnate, right? What the reason that we can, in good conscience, tie this in to this folktale, this folk monster month, is because of the Fawn that is here. Fawns are folktale monsters as old as storytelling, right? Going back to ancient Greek mythology and the idea of Pan, who actually people tend to forget in Greek mythology was a deity. He was not just a nymph who was around. He was a deity who didn't necessarily fit in with everyone because he sprung forth from the earth. And so the idea of the Fawn, the satyr, the Pan, this goes way back. What's incredible about what's presented to us here in the Fawn in this movie is how true it is to every version of the mythological Fawn ever. It's insane. There's a little, like, a master class that I took earlier this year, and there was an entire chapter on fawns. And as you read through it, like, I went back and grabbed my textbook here. Thank you. Thank you. And so as I read back through kind of the history of the idea of the Fawn, all of these things that are the reasons that Fawn have existed throughout mythology are presented in this one character. The idea that he is both just wild, he's loving, he's benevolent, he's terrifying, and he's all of these things, and we see them portrayed so beautifully. And the idea that nature is neither good nor evil, it just is encompassed perfectly in him, right? Because we see the evil in the Francoist army. We see the good in the rebels that are just fighting for their people. We see the good in Ophelia and trying to take care of her family. We see the bad. There's so much black and white. And then in the Fawn, we get this amazing gray area where the whole time we don't know. We have no idea what his intentions are. You know, you watch enough of these movies about monsters and you always question, what are their motives? What is he chained to? What part of this reality is he trying to free himself from? And so you're constantly questioning his motives. And I mean, portrayed perfectly, surprising no one, by Doug Jones. He constantly keeps us guessing as to what his motivations are. And it's absolutely amazing how in his, again, limited screen time, more than the Pale Man, but in his limited screen time, Guillermo del Toro did he educated the world on what the Fawn has always been. And this one took on a very different meaning in the movie than our previous folk monsters had. You know, we had the here's a take on mermaids that goes back to the idea of the siren, but also we modernized it. You know, here's just a Bigfoot, but you don't actually get to see one, right? Here's trolls, but they've never changed. Like it's not that we don't have to teach you the history about them because it's also their present. The Fawn is older than that and has changed slightly throughout history as these tellings have happened. And Del Toro gives a baller ass lesson in it without ever making it feel like exposition or like you were sitting in a class to learn this stuff. He just presents us with a character that is nature. It is a character that is exactly what you expect from the world, which is I can do it or not, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to hope for the best. And every time I watch this movie, I fall more in love with this character of Pan and of the Fawn, because you're right. At first time you see him, it's scary. And then he starts talking and you're like, oh, this dude's slick. He's smooth. You know, he's got it. And then you eventually see him outside of the center of the labyrinth, where you can more accurately see how fucking huge he is.
Yeah, it's massive.
When he's in the bedroom, you're just like, oh God. Like, I knew he was big compared to that little girl, but now that I'm seeing him standing in a normal people's house, I would be so scared. And she just barely ever is, and is immediately just accepting quests from her because he's so charismatic. And I love this character of the Fawn. And like I said, every time I enjoyed it even more this time after my little class here and learning so much about it. So it's amazing how that character is a history lesson and you don't even know it. And it's so true to the origins of all things Fawn, Pan, Satyr that I was even more blown away now. And so I can't say anything else about it because I've talked longer than he's been on screen. But
it was 5 minutes. I looked it up, by the way. 5 minutes. He spends 5 minutes on screen, and the majority of that is in the background, out of focus.
Yeah.
And he says not one word. In fact, the only sounds he makes are like wheezing sounds. And I did look up Darth Vader, by the way. I was wrong. He is in The Empire Strikes Back for 13 minutes.
No.
In A New Hope, he's in the movie for 9 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then 14 minutes in Return of the Jedi, for that whopping half an hour for the entire The entire series.
Right.
Wow.
So now that everybody has listened to me wax poetically about a fairy tale monster, let's get into Dave's cup of tea, because we've as we've talked about how beautiful the storytelling in this movie is. What we are now going to get to is how just beautiful the movie is. So in a section that we're calling Del Toro's Finest Hour, I mean, tell us about what makes this movie pop, Dave.
There is, again, something that we talked about when we did Crimson Peak. When we talked about how ghosts represent different things. We talked about color. Guillermo del Toro loves to work with color. There's basically 2 color palettes in this movie, and they are warm and cool. But there's a third color palette that I think is really interesting, that exists kind of somewhere in the middle there. So obviously the things that take place in the real world are cool, right? They're very steely. It's a lot of like gray blues, gray greens. Like there's that one scene where Captain Vidal's like out in the middle of the day, sun. He's got these like dark sunglasses on.
Yeah.
And it's just like weirdly cool.
Yeah.
Like it's unreal almost, the way that it looks. It looks like a painting, you know. It's beautiful in how it's rendering everything so like dark. And then all the shit that takes place in the fantasy worlds, much brighter. Even though it's happening underground, it's much brighter. The colors are warmer, right? Like look at the pale man behind us. Like you would expect this to be under that blue light. You would expect this to be darkly lit, and yet it's not. We see him bright, warm, right in the center. And so like these 2 things are like diametrically opposed. Like the real world people, right? This is what should be presented as beautiful, except that for Ophelia, like that is the opposite of what it is. And there's a chance that in this dark world that's underneath everything, she might be able to escape her reality. So those color palettes are twisted there. The thing that I think is really interesting is that the one place that exists in between both of them, where it's so dark you can't really tell anything other than the color green, which kind of unites both these worlds, is the Fawn's lair, where the portal is, right?
Yeah.
Only thing you see is green. Everything is just black or gray. Like it's so dark you can't really tell what's going on there. His use of color in this movie is painterly, man, and mimics exactly what Ophelia is seeing in these scenes. And interestingly, when Ophelia is in the scene, it's lit lighter than when she's not in the scene, because she is like the one shining beacon, the hope for the future, right? And then when she's not in those scenes, they are darker, which is why the one scene where we see Vidal without his wife, without Ophelia, without anyone there, it's just him by the train, the lighting is weird.
Yeah.
It's very weird. It doesn't look like reality, because his reality is so much darker, so much bleaker. Like he lives in that hatred. And that's the same way that his office is lit. Like it's a world of total desolation. There's barely any light that comes in there. I mean, there has to be some light, because otherwise we're not going to see, but like there's barely any light in any of the scenes where it's just him. And when we go out into the forest, when we go into the hills, the lighting totally changes. Same color palette, but the lighting is changing. We're seeing more light, and it's natural light. It's so wild, man. And then finally at the end of the movie, when like Ophelia's fleeing and it's like her worlds are meshing, we're seeing these explosions happening, and the explosions are bringing about warmth into this steely darkness. We're seeing the oranges and the yellows all come about in the background as this dark world, this cool world is what she's like going out into. I always stop and wonder, I'm like, is she really going to cross over into a portal?
Right.
It's a beautiful use of color, man. I mean, I also love that there is no question about the fact that it's a fantasy world when she's dead. Or or rather as she's dying, because it's like kind of the last thing she sees before she dies, right? And it doesn't look anything like anything else.
Yeah. It's interesting that when I just went on and on about Fawn, and I kept mentioning, this movie's called Pan's Labyrinth, right?
Mhm.
And so the idea that if you say, hey, have you ever heard the story of Pan, or do you know what a satyr is? People picture goat bottom, human half. And so I did try to get into the idea of trying to figure out why he decided to go with this completely earthen version of the Fawn, and stumbled across a very cool story that goes into the making of this. So the idea of the Fawn as presented here in Pan's Labyrinth actually comes from Del Toro's self-described experiences as a child with lucid dreaming. And when he was a kid, he had multiple instances where he would wake up at midnight and he would see this Fawn in his room. And he has described that to this day, he is 100% sure that it was not just a reoccurring dream as much as it was something that he was controlling. So you say the idea of, I don't know what's going on in his head. Apparently it's been going on in there for a long time. And every night when he would wake up at midnight and find himself in control of this dream, he would beckon the Fawn closer and closer. And it would get a little bit closer. He'd kind of lose control. He'd wake up, or it would disappear, and he would move on, and he would try again the next night. And then when it finally got close enough to him that he could see it, he saw it as being completely made from the earth. And that is where the idea for the moss and all of this and the beastly kind of face come from. And so, yeah, like, we wonder this idea of like, where does he come up with this stuff? Apparently, since he was a kid, he has been literally dreaming this stuff up in a way and then remembering it, which, let's face it, is also an accomplishment. I couldn't tell you anything I've dreamed about in the past. I couldn't tell you what I dreamed about last night, let alone something I dreamed about when I was a kid. I have one reoccurring night terror from when I was a child that I can still remember. Other than that, I got nothing.
Same.
Yeah. And so he quite literally dreamed into existence the most amazing version of this mythological character, which is it's just a testament to what he always does. And what he always does is he creates memorable characters and memorable monsters. Go back and watch his Hellboy movies. Is Golden Army going to win an Oscar? No. Is it visually stunning? Hell to the yes. Yeah. Everything in it is so perfectly and beautifully crafted. When you see the scene where she goes to visit the Pale Man, if you appreciate Del Toro, then what you start to look at so many details. And whenever you read anything about Del Toro, the man loves for the shit to be that detailed, and he loves for it all to be made by hand. And you go and you look at that table and you look at the intricacies in the ways that the locks where she ends up getting the dagger are. And I find myself trying to find, every time I watch it, I try to figure out, why does she not go with the middle lock? Why does she not go with the middle lock? The Fawn specifically told her, let the fairies guide you. The fairies said middle lock. The picture in the book showed a girl unlocking the middle lock. And I've never definitively come up with anything. But every time I try to look, I notice something else that's just so beautifully crafted in those locks and in that area. The pictures that appear in the book, just all of that stuff, it's just gorgeous. Like, even if you're me and you recognize color palettes, but you can't put all the meaning into it that you did, it's easy to appreciate just the fact that it's so gorgeous the
Yeah.
way he's always doing it. And that's the word that we're always going to land on. And I hope we always will land on as we do Del Toro movies, is that the man knows how to shoot a gorgeous ass movie.
And part of that is that his cinematographer, Guillermo Navarro, was it? Let's see, Guillermo Navarro. Yeah. They sat and worked everything out. They knew exactly what this movie was going to look like before like anything happened. It was the very first thing that happened was what is this movie going to look like? And so they decided on three rather classic Kodak film stocks for this. and they chose their lights specifically to go against how this film stock is normally used, because they wanted it to look like a classic film, right? Like, think about how many war movies we've seen that
Right.
are probably shot using the same film stock. You want it to kind of, be an homage for that. Like, how many times have you seen Bridge Over the River Kwai? Probably not as many times as I have, because I'm an old movie nerd, right?
Yeah.
But these are the kinds of movies that would play over and over and over again on TV when Del Toro's a kid, and he's probably watching these movies like, fuck yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to make it like that, because I'm making a war picture. But also, it's like, no, I'm making my war picture, So he's using these classic film stocks that we're going to recognize subconsciously, because very, very few people, I think, that aren't in the film industry are nerdy enough to be like, so what film did they use in this? Like, who's fucking doing that, right? Not only because I'm a nerd, right? But then he's also using like classic film lenses here. He's using Zeiss lenses that, like, most guys these days, and I do realize that this is 2006, but even in 2006, the standard was Panasonic lenses, like, and Panasonic cameras. Like, these are what people just went to, because for years it had been the standard. That's not what they did. They went back to like old school 1950s and 60s film stocks, and they went to old school 1950s and 60s film lenses. And that's why this movie looks the way that it does. But it's also lit in a totally unconventional way. The color palette is totally unconventional. Like, they're using these films to deliver something odd, and we recognize it as odd through this, like, conventional and traditional medium. It's wild what he does, and the fact that, like, he does it time and time again.
Yeah.
He just doesn't miss. Because if it was like one, and I was like, yeah, all right, so you did it once, good job, man. Like, it's more than I've done it, but like, the well's gonna run dry at some point, and then the very next one is like, haha, see, I told you, flash in the pan. Not Del Toro, dude.
Yeah. Well, I think we've hit it all. I think that we've rounded this up. I don't think that there's much left except for us to rate this movie. Now, here at Shiver, we don't use stars. It's not fair to rate a movie against each other. So for every movie that we do, we create a unique rating system, because we are only looking at this movie, what it was trying to give us, and how well it delivered on that. So today, Dave, out of a possible 5 eyeball palms, what do you give Pan's Labyrinth?
6. That's
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're still with us, which a bunch of you have been, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You knew where this was going. This is 100% 6. There's not a frame, not a stitch, not a light that should be changed in this movie. everything's done perfectly. Everybody delivers perfectly in what they're supposed to do. I mean, you said it at the top. I said it before we even got into this. This is not only one of like my favorite like fantasy horror movies of all time. This is probably a top 10 of all time movie for me.
Very
It
likely.
it's just so incredible in everything it does. So if you've been listening to us go on and on about it, you knew that one was coming. We've said it all. There's nothing left to be said. Thank you to everybody who has hung around. We've had quite a few viewers with us tonight. We did have Terry Ballinger chiming in saying she's been waiting to see this one. So hopefully if there was anything keeping you from it, we
Stop
have given
waiting.
you the reason now. Yeah. Quit waiting. Get out there and watch this thing. It's I don't know if it's streaming anywhere. Like I said, I own it, you own it, but
Yeah.
go buy it. Just go buy it. Give Del Toro
It's worth it. You're gonna rewatch it.
Yeah, give Del Toro a couple bucks, right? So he can keep making these amazing things.
Yeah.
And while you're online buying this movie, make sure you head to shiverpod.com where you can find links to all of our social media. We are on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. All of those places at ShiverPod. And keep an eye out there because we will be announcing Folk Monster Movie Month is over. And normally in October, what we do is we do a bunch of movies that are centered around Halloween, but that wouldn't necessarily fit the vibe of Year of the Monsters. So, Dave, do you want to kind of tell them what we're going to be doing for October?
So for October, hang on a second. I'm having a brain fart. I want to make sure I'm going to say the right thing because I'm almost certain that I remember, but let's see. Okay, so we are doing. Hang on.
He's almost there, guys. He's finding it.
Oh, wait. The classic monsters.
That's right. For the month of October, we are going to be bringing you versions of the most classic movie and story monsters. We are going to be hitting all the high points, all the ones that you know that have been around forever. We're going to pick out one version of them and we're going to bring them to you for 5 Wednesdays in October. So we've got plenty to work with here.
I can't believe that we haven't done some of these.
Yeah. This is we've got some good ones on deck. It is planned out. Also been talking to a couple people about joining for some of them. We're gonna have some fun. We're gonna do it. Thank you to everybody for sticking around. We love y'all. It's been great.
Absolutely. So on behalf of all of us here at Shiver, fright you very much.